if you ask me how divinity expresses itself, Sanskrit, the sounds of Sanskrit is one of the ways. It's not just the language of gods, it's also the language of the demons in our Patapyadi is a system of numbering. People have done all sorts of magic. So sadanchita mudanchita nikunchita padanjhala jhalanchalita manjukatakam. So you don't see a or e or u or a or I. These long vowels, not there. If there are any kids who are watching this, this settle in life never really comes. Guys, you are being fooled. There was a transfer of 30 rupees or 33 rupees of some kind, and she said, "Bhaiya, I have only this much. I get pocket money from my parents." And that kind of it can't be matched with any kind of number. Bhavani tvam dase mayi vitara drushtim sakaruna ite stotum vanchan kathayati bhavani tvamiti yah tadaiva tvam tasmai dishasi nija sayojya padavi mukunda brahmendra sputamakuta nirajita padam.
Today we have with us Uday Shreyas of the Sanskrit channel. He has around 6 lakh subscribers and he's trying to make Sanskrit easy, fun and simple. So welcome Anand.
Thank you, Anand. Namaskaram. Thank you for having me.
So the first question is...
We're directly getting into questions. Okay, this is the first time I'm doing anything like this, so thank you for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know you have been...
Pleasure is mine.
Only putting out content on the Sanskrit channel, not talking much about yourself.
Yeah.
So thank you for giving me this opportunity and coming on our channel.
Totally my pleasure.
So first I'll begin by asking some questions about Sanskrit and then we'll get to your personal story and then spirituality, of course. Okay. So first question is, why Sanskrit considered such a great language, and what is it in Sanskrit that is not there in any of the other languages?
Okay. The answers could be extremely long. So let's tackle them point by point. Greatness of any language. So it's people generally, there is this opinion in the world that it's a great language. People know that for sure. There are praises. People know about Sanskrit than the Sanskrit language itself. So why this talk about the greatness of the language has come about in the world, I think is probably because of the nature of the knowledge systems that are present. Almost all of Indic knowledge systems are present in Sanskrit, like all the Shastras, Vedas, Upanishads, Puranas, Itihasas, and if any field of study that you want, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, poetry, and the most profound language, the most extensive set of literature is available in Sanskrit. So probably that is one of the reasons why people kind of agree that Sanskrit is a great language. So greatness of the language, in my perspective, it is one of the most profound languages. All languages have their own beauty and their own set of knowledge systems and their own aesthetics to them. But Sanskrit language is the closest to how the sounds of nature are. I made multiple videos on this on the channel, and I'm not sure how deeper I can get into that particular aspect of how close Sanskrit is, the sounds of Sanskrit are to the way things are in nature. For example, Surya and Urja, that Ur sound, if you look at it, right, these common sounds which are present across multiple words which have these commonalities, it's very, very, it's connected at the nature of its property itself. Any object, its property and the sound which is associated with it are not two different things. These are called as Vak and Artha. One of the famous shlokas by Kalidasa goes as Vagartha viva sampraktau. So this Vak and Artha, the sound and its meaning, the sound and the meaning that we attribute with that sound are the closest in Sanskrit language. That is what makes it so profound. Otherwise, greatness, all languages, I mean, everybody thinks their own mother tongue is great. So in that sense, every language is great in my opinion. What is there in Sanskrit which is not there in any other language? If you look at it, actually, most of, not just the Indian languages, but the world languages have a lot of commonality with Sanskrit. I personally do not know for sure if Sanskrit is the mother tongue, is the source from which all of these languages came about. But I'm definitely, I know for sure why this impression came about, and if it is true for sure or not, I'm not sure. But why this impression comes about is because of this closeness with how sounds are and what they convey. And this is what most languages try to convey, but with cultural influences, with their own types of diet and the regional climate, everything, the way they express it changes. So heart, for example, is hridaya. I heard in many other European languages it has a similar sound, the hr sound, hridaya, and in Sanskrit it's the same sound. So there is this connect, and this is not just with these simple words that I'm talking about. If you keenly observe, you find these commonalities with every other word for everything. Mother, matra, father, pitra, all these sounds. Brother, bhratra, all these sounds. So what is there in Sanskrit which is not there in any other language which you talked about? The possibility of having these sounds directly influence one's own mental and physical well-being is probably the most strongly felt in Sanskrit because of that proximity. So this possibility of having mantras and all these shlokas that we do for Parayanam and the benefits that they have, probably that is one aspect which is the most profoundly felt in Sanskrit. Once again, there are Hanuman Chalisa is there for and in Telugu as well there are, and in Kannada there are multiple compositions like this which are supposed to, which have these benefits of physiological well-being. But again, the diverse set of sounds, the most profound possibilities exist in Sanskrit. So that is what sets Sanskrit apart from the rest of the languages.
I heard it is called as the language of the gods.
Yeah.
How did this term got to Sanskrit?
So again, I personally like to.
Is there
so
any
there are
story
multiple ways of approaching this. Yeah. So generally in our culture, which is dialectical, which is expressed in terms of stories, people would just say that this answer would be very simple, like how you would give an answer to a child. In Swargaloka, in everything, Narada and Vishnu and Shiva, everybody, they talk to each other in Sanskrit. Of course, this is how you can look at it. At another level, you can also, at a more abstract level, you can look at it as the language of nature itself, right? It is, as I said from the very first answer, because the sounds are so closely related to how things are in nature. That is the language of gods. That is the language of divinity. That how it expresses itself. So if you ask me how divinity expresses itself, Sanskrit, the sounds of Sanskrit is one of the ways. That is one of the reasons Sanskrit is called the language of gods. See, when you chant something and a particular deity is supposed to be pleased by your chant or your shloka or your mantra, and then they give you that benefit, one level of looking at it is, yes, there is an external force in the universe which you can access by chanting these sounds. So that is, at one level, Sanskrit is the language of gods. At the same level, these forces that are manifest in the universe, those are what caused your body to, come up like this in this series of evolution. Like all those forces work within yourself. You're a consequence of all those forces working in the universe. So at one level, all these deities that we talk about, all these devas and the asuras, in Bhagavad Gita there is one chapter called Daiva Asura Sampad Vibhaga. So these devas and asuras are, within you. These are qualities that are within you. So it's not just the language of gods; it's also the language of the demons in our culture. So so many people know about these ashirvadas that you can give in Sanskrit: Tathastu, Shubhamastu, Kalyana Praptirastu, Suputra Praptirastu. There are also curse words in Sanskrit. Many people do not know about this, probably because teachers don't, teach students this extensively.
Yeah, that is an
but
interesting
many people, like everybody, I used to do this for sure. If you want to learn a new language, the first thing that they teach is kuch gali sikhao. But in Sanskrit, these galis, it's not very safe also to teach other people, because they might end up working, like having effect. Why? So it's a language of both gods and demons for sure.
Can you give us a word in Sanskrit?
Oh, there are simple words like gardhaba or kukura. You can donkey, dog, you know. But stuff like get lost or may you be ruined. Stuff like this, right? The F word or something else. There are words, but
Okay, for that.
why? Why say may you be ruined or may you fail or something else to somebody when you don't? So it's not good to. It's that is the whole thing of shapam, right? This shrap or shapam and shapaha. You curse somebody literally, and you use your own energy to. You expend your own energy while doing that process. It doesn't happen all the time. It depends on how much energy you have within your own system and which what you have built up. But yeah, गालियाँ भी है. तो सिर्फ देवों का नहीं राक्षसों का भी language. So it is.
You were saying that Galia we had, like the word Sanskrit, I read that it means complete.
Well done. Some is equanimous, it's good, it's balanced, it's nice and everything. Krita is creating. So this word kr, right? Create and krita. You see this commonality of sounds in English. Think maybe it's something else, but if you look at this, all these common sounds they come about. So something which is well created is Sanskrit. Maybe if you put, like I put on my videos, if you put well created Sanskrit, the people can see those sounds match up. Yeah. Is there any other sound which looks I'm not sure. Nothing comes to mind. But yeah.
I read it means that completely done or something like that.
Yeah, many interpretations. This is another possibility that you can interpret in many ways. There is one.
But I have also read that Sanskrit is one language which is not unambiguous, which means that there are words for each and everything you want to describe. So it leaves very little, scope for interpretations.
No. You might also have heard this. So these popular notions, right? Have you also heard this popular notion that for an elephant, there are 10 different or 50 different ways you can describe an elephant. That goes for every other thing. So if you have a word, it's not unambiguous. I would also call it ambiguous at the same time. The ambiguity is resolved with context. It's very contextual. Depends on what is being conveyed in that particular instance. Any particular word can be interpreted as many things. For example, padapa is pada pa. Something that drinks, pa, with feet, pada. What comes to mind? Something that drinks with its feet. Don't just think of the animal kingdom. In creation in general. A tree, right? Padapa. Yeah. So the same thing, same tree can also be called as a vriksha, which is very common. So padapa is because it drinks water from its foot. Vriksha is because it grows, vardhate and kshiyate, and it decays. Both of these words are not just common to a tree. If you look at a lotus flower or a lotus stalk, that also drinks in water from its feet. If you think of an elephant, that pada is not necessarily again just a foot. It is also 1/4 or one limb. So it also takes water from one of its limbs. It uses that trunk. So an elephant can also be interpreted as a padapa. A vriksha, anything in creation, literally which grows and then decays, is a vriksha. So there is definitely ambiguity. It's not unambiguous at all. But if there is there is definitely ambiguity which gets resolved with, the context in which it is being said. If in some shloka they say she took rest below a padapa, then here it is a tree or something like that. In the context it gets resolved. It is very unambiguous, as you said, in terms of grammar. Because in grammar, I don't know how technical you want me to get into things. There for sure about these vibhaktis and all these pratyayas and how Rama, Rama. These vibhakti sounds are contexts that are being added to that word. If Rama is being used in a sentence, how is that word being used? How is that person being addressed? Is something being done to him, or something is being taken from him, is a relation of him being talked about. All that gets changed with the word itself. You don't add more words to it. So to Rama becomes Ramaya from Ramat. If there are both those Ramas, then it has a separate, it has its own unique pratyaya to it. So based on these, it is the grammar aspect of it is very unambiguous. One of the reasons why they say it is very conducive for programming is because of this. Because is that one of your questions? Is it?
Yeah, I wanted to ask that. Why is it? I mean, we hear Sanskrit as it is more suitable for coding and all.
Yeah.
So why is it that so?
I'm not sure if that is really the case. Many people say so. Some NASA scientist somewhere before is supposed to have written a paper, and we have just clung on to it like crazy. There are such
they actually
diverse
using
sets of
it or
literature. I have no clue, Anna, because why use it, right? So at the very beginning of going on that pursuit of coding something in Sanskrit, of writing it, because I come from it. I mean, I have a technical background myself. Why use it for programming when already such, such extensive level of development has already been done in multiple other languages, programming languages? Does it lend itself to other aspects of technology? Maybe. I'm not the right person. I mean, I don't have that know-how. But it is definitely very technical. Again, Panini is a rishi who wrote the rules of Sanskrit grammar. And if you look at those rules of Sanskrit grammar, all the rules of which sounds combine with which sounds to form which sounds. So there are multiple sandhis and all these things that we have learnt in as children in language textbooks. All these rules of grammar are conveyed in an extremely mathematical form in a very small sutra. How great a scientific deduction is measured in terms of how simple the equation is. If you look at some of the greatest equations of science, their greatness is measured in how simply they can be conveyed. Like the conversion of mass and energy, or many other like force and mass, like acceleration and mass, all that. These equations, when you can boil down their essence to a very simple, very intuitive formula, you know that this is how the universe functions. Then you have unlocked how laws of nature function. And this grammar rules which Panini has laid out also boil down to such succinct, such simple, short sutras. And from those sutras, you can slowly build elaborate equations, like how you would expand an equation into multiple use cases. In this situation also, you can expand those small sutras, grammar sutras, into multiple, into broader formula, for broader applications. So in that sense, yes, it is very scientific. Is it really conducive to code? I'm not sure.
Since you brought Panini, so Panini is the person who formalized Sanskrit language.
Correct.
So what is his work? I mean, for people who do not know.
So one of the greatest contributions of Panini Maharshi has been this text called Ashtadhyayi. It is a text of around a little more than like 3,500 sutras. 3,500 sutras. That number, I just casually said that word, that number out. It's 3,500 sutras. So that is one of his major works. So this is called as Ashtadhyayi. It has 8 adhyayas, and they teach this Ashtadhyayi in slightly advanced Sanskrit courses, where people go through these 3,500 odd sutras and then decode its meaning, how it is used, and they are all very intuitive to how the human vocal cavity functions. If you look at those sutras, it's not because there is a sutra that we have to say a specific sound in a certain way. It is because a specific sound is said in a certain way. Panini Maharshi realized it and then saw how it can be expressed in terms of, it's not because f is equal to mg or something else, or e is equal to mc squared, that it functions like that, that nature functions like that. It is because nature functions like that, somebody realized it and then made it into an equation which is simple to to present. That is the same with Vyakarana Sutras and Ashtadhyayi. This is how human vocal cavity functions, and from there Panini presented it in those simple, short, succinct sutras.
So how was the Sanskrit language before Panini? I mean, the history of Sanskrit language.
Alright.
I know that it has been only dialectically passed through
Yeah.
Guru Shishya Parampara.
Before Panini, yeah. So language as such was definitely there before Panini was, and Panini saw how the language was, and then came up with the Vyakarana Sutras. One thing that I have to confess is I'm not a scholar of any merit. So whatever I've learned is through my own narrow lens of just looking at what is relevant to me. I have not done any measure of scholarly study as to what dating. So one thing that I really am not, I'm very ambiguous about, and I don't really want to get into that field also, is how old is a specific text. Right? People like to do this. Are Vedas really the oldest texts? Like what is Rig Veda really the oldest? Who cares? I mean, at least I don't care. Look at the content of the text. Is it relevant to you? Is it not relevant to you? How profound is it? How valuable is it in your own personal life? If it is valuable, I love it. I accept it from any source. So that is how I approach it. These kinds of discussions, maybe they are relevant to historians and people who want to debate these kind of things. I'm not nowhere near those pursuits.
I saw one of your videos where you say Sanskrit is very simple in terms of grammar, so that
Did you watch? Did you? I mean, if I said that, I would also have presented something.
Yeah, you said you can add something in the beginning and at the end of the.
How did you feel? You felt it was simple? Didn't feel it was simple?
I mean, I haven't gone through from the beginning. I haven't learned Sanskrit much.
Okay.
But it is also said like whenever Sanskrit is spoken of, it is a very complex language. They say. So how does these two contrasting things come up for Sanskrit?
So one of the two things is correct, and I have either lied in the video or people are lying about the complexity of it.
Maybe they are.
It is very intuitive. There is definitely complexity to it. There is definitely a learning curve which is steep. But to get started with, people need not be exposed to that level of complexity. It can be started, it can be taught. People who are beginners to the language need not be exposed to that level of complexity. Because something which is complex is also very enjoyable at one level. See, people like math. I can't relate to those people. There are people who like all these complex calculations and all these theories and formulas. But you wouldn't introduce them to a beginner, right? Once you develop a certain flair for the language, you like doing those things, you like those challenges, and you like all that exploration. Then you kind of expose a student. You introduce those aspects to a student. But this is the case with any other pursuit. If you look at it, anything like any difficulty in any game, for example. Every game has like multiple levels of complexity to it. If you are playing with a child, if you are introducing a chess game to a child, you wouldn't start with like high complex strategies and all that. So you'd start simple. This animal moves like this. This is the king. This is the queen. You explain it as simple terms as possible. So in that sense, okay, this is probably a good analogy. Is chess as a game complex or is it simple? If you look at it, it's very simple. There are only 8 kinds of pieces. Even there, it is just only half of them are unique. So it's very simple arrangement of 8 by 8 grid. You play. But if you go into deeper and deeper levels of it, Vishwanath Anand or somebody else, I don't know the chess players, I know only that guy. So they enjoy that level of complexity, and then this comes about. And if you present these strategies and all these castle formation and all that high funda stuff, then they would enjoy it. So yes, there is a level of simplicity to it, which is very intuitive. If you know any, not just in Indian language, even if you have that inclination towards observing sounds and how they form their meanings, it's very intuitive. The sounds are that pursuit is very rewarding. It's very it's immediately rewarding to a child to get started with. If you go deeper and deeper into it, as you level up in your game, there are complex dimensions that unfurl. But not beginners, as I make videos for my audiences who mostly come there for the first time. They already have gone through a trauma of intermediate or high school Sanskrit. I don't want to tell them there are complex dimensions to Sanskrit. I just want to tell them this is simple. This you should probably cut out of your video or do something like that. But anyways, there are both dimensions to Sanskrit. It offers intellectually stimulating challenges for every background, every age group.
You talked about, I mean, we talked about this Sanskrit is best suitable for coding and all.
Okay.
Maybe it's true or not. Somebody gave the theory. I mean, I've also read that the value of pi, there is something called as Katapayani Sankhya.
Yeah.
Can you, what is that? Can you
So
explain?
there is this system of numbering called as Katapayadi. So there is this again value of pi which has been mentioned in Katapayadi Sankhyas using a shloka. I can't recall that shloka immediately, but what Katapayadi system basically is, this sound ka is the first sound of the consonants, right? Ka, ka, ga, gha, ga. So, and there are 5 groups like that. All the consonants are arranged into 5 groups called as vargas. The first one is ka, starts with ka. There are 5 of them, ka, kha, ga, gha, ma. The next row is cha. The next one is ta. Why did we skip that cha in between? Is because the numbers are from 0 to 9, right? So you assign each of those 10 numerals 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, from starting from ka, ka, kha, ga, gha, nga, and cha, cha, ja, jha, nya. Now all those 10 numbers are done. The next line again starts with ka, ta. So you start the numbering again from ta. So like that you assign a numeral to each of those consonants. Now what happens is any word that you say, right? It has these vowels and consonants in it. You then go on now assigning numbers. Vowels don't have number of their own, they're 0. And consonants, depending on which consonant is present in that shloka, you assign that number. And using this system of numbering, Katapayadi is a system of numbering, people have done all sorts of magic. Also literally magic, using, like, they've conveyed dates of particular times in which compositions have been made. They have done Fibonacci sequences. They have expressed the value of pi to like extreme precision, to a lot of numeral value, decimal places. All sorts of magic, all sorts of.
So does
feats.
this mean that somebody who wrote that shloka, he had something like this in mind? Or?
Again, the value of pi is not because somebody came up with the idea of pi. It exists as reality around us in nature. We are very we are very full of ourselves that we think, we discovered pi, come on, we now know the number, or we discovered the Fibonacci sequence, or we discovered the golden. We have discovered those things, the golden ratio, but these are manifest in everything, that in the way creation is around us. So people who realize this, that is one of the drawbacks of, I think personally, of Sanskrit, that people don't arrive at what they have realized in a logical way that others can reproduce, or even if it can, it takes humongous personal striving to get to that stage. In Western systems of mathematics or scientific pursuits, there is a logical step-by-step process to how you got to that number, or how you got to that thing. So everybody else uses that formula, applies those same steps, they arrive at the same conclusion. Why it is so? So if somebody says, okay, this is perimeter of a circle divided by its diameter, okay, that makes some logical sense. But if it's presented in a shloka of some sort, and he has given that decimal value of pi to some degree, I mean, I don't know what. It's hard to kind of relate with the practical benefit of that shloka. It's this again, this narrow perspective of what is there in it for me, what is there in it for my use. That kind of is a narrow mindset to look at it. But yeah, this system of expressing complex mathematical realizations in beautiful pieces of literature is made possible by Katapayadi numbering.
It is magical to imagine that value of pi is expressed in the form of a shloka.
Yeah.
Like in your learning of Sanskrit, what are like some mind-blowing things you have come across, like which blowed your mind?
Everything. You wouldn't realize one single word. I just look at it and it blows my mind. It's because when I find these patterns of commonality between multiple sounds and origins, and you know what blew my mind, what comes to mind right now, this is one of the main reasons why I do this, because this keeps blowing my mind on a regular basis, and I love that feeling of this is utterly brilliant. This word we speak in Telugu most of my, my mother tongue is Tamil, but we speak Telugu at my place. And we've been using this word, upayogam. What is the use, right? So, enti din upayogam enti, what is the use of this thing? Iska upayog hai, isme upayog kiya jata hai, it's used in that sense. I never paid attention to it, that it is made of these two words, upa and yoga. When that, it's I don't know, maybe it seems very simple to you, but when that hit me the first time, I realized I was using this word without knowing that this is a portmanteau of two words, which are so right there in your face, and never really I took it for granted. So these kind of simple things keep blowing my mind, but otherwise, what blew my mind? Sanskrit, everything, so there are one of probably one of the things that I relish the most is poetry, which has magnificence of poetic meter. So there is a Nataraja Stotram composed by Patanjali. He doesn't use any dirgha swaras. It's called Charana Shringa Rahita. Charana means feet, something that is at the end, and Shringa is a horn, which is the very beginning. So Charana and Shringa in the alphabet are names which represent the A ki matra, E ki matra, the long vowels. Like in Telugu they are called Komu Dirgham. So these are, if you put one more line, right? A, or you put an extra E, the long vowels. So this Charana and Shringa are indicative of Nandi and Bhringi, who are attendants of Shiva.
Okay.
So one has horns and one has like animal feet and all that. So when Patanjali Maharshi went to Kailash, both these they stopped Patanjali Maharshi at the gates itself, saying, "You are not, Shiva is in a different zone. He is meditating. You can't go inside." Then he gets enraged. This is a story. This is a beautiful story that he gets. What is this? Do you even know who I am? And what is the need of both you guys is to permission for me to get in? Who are you guys to stop me from going to visit Shiva? And starts praising Shiva, or starts composing verses without the use of Charana and Shringa.
Okay.
I can do without you guys. You're not needed if I want to approach Shiva. And he composes the entire stotram without that dirgha swaras, the long vowels at all. And it goes extremely beautifully. So sadanchita mudanchita nikunchita padanjhala jhalanchalita manjukatakam. So you don't see A or E or U or A or I. These long vowels, not there. And it's so beautiful. It's not like he used improper terminology to compose it. Each word has profound meaning. The essence of it is very profound. But it's done with such mastery over sound that this is not the only one. I'm sure there are multiple examples. There is Shivatandava Stotram. There are many compositions. Kalidasa is like very famous for it. There is. I can just keep on giving examples, but that is what blows my mind the most, when this brilliance of poetry is happening at multiple layers.
So in spirituality, mantra is one of the paths, to attain the highest. So, so mantras, the chanting in the Sanskrit language. So how is this Sanskrit language is used to attain the highest.
So
Can you talk about this tradition a bit?
So the word mantra itself is a Sanskrit term. Mananat trayate iti mantra. So that which trayate. So it's really hard to translate Sanskrit words to English. What is trasa, trana? So one way of looking at it is something that uplifts you. So manana is repetition. Something that delivers benefits to you, that uplifts you, that gives you results by repeated manana is a mantra. Right there, it's there. So tantra, that's all these words have their own etymologies. So the word itself is of Sanskrit origin. And why are they in Sanskrit? Not necessarily. Their origins are definitely in Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is of that kind. All these sounds are not something that that have undergone a lot of cultural influence. They are as pure as they can be to how things are, how the sounds are in nature. So that is why if you want to, if you meditate upon something, the nature of something, then the sound that corresponds to it, you realize. So that is where the entire the science of realizing mantras come from. You know how Vishwamitra Maharshi realized this Gayatri mantra, and that is why he is called Vishwamitra. So you in deep states of meditativeness, the sounds, this is called that state of perception. You perceive things, right? That is one level of perception. Is why it's hard to put what's coming as thoughts to words. That state is called as Ritambhara Prajna, that level of perception. And because you perceive it and it is sound, that is why these Vedas are called as Shruti. So that is why they're called as that which has been heard. Shruti is literally that which has been heard. Why did they call these realizations hearings and not seeing or smelling or tasting? You tasted something, you could call it anything. But because these are sounds of how nature manifests, how existence is, it's called as Shruti. Sages have heard it. So that.
This reminds me of Sadhguru's. There's this article where Sadhguru says Sanskrit is one language where it is called as the blueprint of the existence.
Yeah.
In the sense, there is form, and for every form there is some kind of vibration.
Yes.
And for that there is sound, and that sound is put into script.
That form is the yantra, the sound is the mantra. Using that together is tantra. And the way you write those sounds, right? This Devanagari alphabet or many index scripts also, those also have a significance. That is tantra in itself. The sound and the form of the alphabet. Just the alphabet, does this not blow your mind? That you write something and you're doing tantra right there. People think, Veda is a different approach, tantra is a different approach. No. So these are approaching things as different subjects, Telugu, Hindi, English, Math, Science, Social. Like we had periods for school, like abhi ye subject, uske baad wo pura khatam, uske bare mein, like forget about it, now a completely different subject. No. So if you're doing math, you're doing everything else together. If you're doing medicine, you're doing everything else. Like art and science are not two distinct fields. Like similarly, all these subjects of Tantra, Veda, all this, they all are towards the same pursuit. Some, there's really no boundaries of, hard set boundaries between these knowledge systems. All of them have the same source and realization. If somebody has a profound realization, they express that realization in terms which they knew best, or they perceived them in, or which was most relevant for the society around them then. So this is how all these systems of knowledge came about.
I mean, there are some people who ridiculate that how can mantras, just reciting mantras, can benefit you in, like, as they say, like Gayatri mantra.
Don't do it. Nobody is forcing anybody to do anything. Nobody has ever asked somebody to, on the edge of a knife to chant a mantra. Or maybe I'm really not a history authority.
So what I'm understanding is basically by what you're doing by uttering the Sanskrit language is you are manipulating the energy.
Definitely, definitely. It might, there is a definite possibility that this sounds like airy-fairy talk to somebody who's not been exposed, or who's not already aware of how these things work. But definitely they have that effect on the physical and mental well-being of people, and of course spiritual upliftment.
What has been your experience of, your keen interest in Sanskrit and
like I've grown listening to, most of us grow listening to this simple shloka, Shuklam Bharadram, or Saraswati Namastubhyam. Simple shlokas, right? And you hear these chants and all this. Morning Suprabhatam is anyways there. And even if in your house it doesn't play, in the neighbor's house it's playing, and you end up hearing it. Somewhere or the other you keep hearing it. I never really paid any attention to it, but I kind of found languages very fascinating. Probably because we used to get transferred every 3 years. So every new place we go, I used to find those languages. It was a challenge at one level that I have to make new friends again. Now, a different dialect or a different language, even if it's the same language, the way it is spoken is different, much different in how Telugu is spoken in Telangana is much different from how it is spoken in Andhra Pradesh and how Rayalaseema speaks it. So I used to find these very fascinating, how the same word can mean entirely different things in two different languages, and at the same time sometimes all of them have the same sounding word for the same thing. So all of these nuances of language I found extremely fascinating, and I used to love languages. Most of my, in 8th, 9th, when this IIT foundation stuff was going on, where people were getting, tortured for extra classes and all that stuff, extra syllabus and coaching, people really neglected. That is really when you start neglecting these other unnecessary subjects. The important subjects are M by PC and all that stuff. That is where you have that extra coaching also, and people slowly start neglecting English or Telugu or Hindi and languages. But I used to love languages, and teachers used to love me for it. That okay, this guy at least is paying attention. Language
somebody was listening.
Yeah. And in Telugu we used to have this poetry. Poetry used to be quite advanced, Telugu poetry, even in SSC itself. And there used to be these star-marked poems. So in exam, like final examination, only those star-marked poems will be asked. You don't have to read the entire work of poetry if you don't want to. If the lesson is given, because the flow of idea has to be there from start to end. So they'll give the entire poem, but only some stanzas are star-marked. Only people mug up those and then attend the exam. But I used to love everything. I used to sit with the teachers and then ask, okay, this is so nice, this is the meter used in this, all that stuff I used to do since childhood. But Sanskrit as a language, I really only paid attention to it. It came into my life in intermediate once, because easy marks. Intermediate mein le lo Sanskrit, like easy marks, and you can write. I wrote it in English. I have no clue what happened in intermediate. I'm sorry, I mugged stuff up. Rama Ramaha again, I put slips. And then I just copied everything and passed somehow. And I got good marks also. I think I got good marks. Taking Sanskrit has served its purpose and done. Like one time trauma you endure to get what you want and done. Once I realized what a lost possibility that was, that is when it hit me that this could have been done so impactfully that people could have exposed the most beautiful aspects of Sanskrit language when people were actually taking Sanskrit. Maybe it's done with that intention in mind that you have to introduce the language, it has to, permeate among the society, all that. But people really don't. That purpose is not served by this incentive of giving it easy marks. But anyways, I'm diverging. So never really paid any attention to Sanskrit then. But then after I got into a 9-to-5 job when I was 21, because campus placements, of course, you have to compete there also, get a good well-paying job and then settle, which never really happens if you just pay attention. If there are any kids who are watching this settle in life never really comes, guys. You're being fooled. But anyways, So I got into a 9 to 5 job at 21, and I was, because it was not what I wanted to do, of course it was torture. So, and there were people who loved it, who loved doing it, not that everybody who goes to a 9 to 5 job is being tortured. I did not want to do it, I did not want that in my life. That was not what I wanted to be doing. Maybe I don't know, maybe could have or would have. But that is when I started looking for more juicy things, more, like something that makes life brighter than the dreary stuff I was going through. So that is when I started picking all sorts of hobbies, like any odd thing. Like there is this website called meetup.com where you find all these hobby clubs and all that stuff. Every damn thing I used to sign up and then go and see what people are doing, to just bring that rasa into life. And that is when I started learning all sorts of skills, and origami to Japanese, French, all just dabbling in everything. Then one colleague suggested that there is this organization called Sanskrit Bharati, which has these textbooks, or not exactly textbooks, but they have books to learn Sanskrit. There is Gita Sopanam and there is all that. Why don't you, because you are doing all this extracurricular things anyways, I am interested in that, why don't you join me? So we found like 4 or 5 people in our office, and then every day after lunch we used to spend some time going through those texts, and that is when I found it's actually it's coming very naturally, it's coming very easily. It's very, I'm finding all this literature very intuitive to relate to. And so that kind of became a habit that practice stuck on, that like multiple months we were reading those texts every day after lunch. And slowly that skill grew. I developed a knack for the language. And I was kind of up in the clouds that, Sanskrit, of course, I know it. That is when I was reading all sorts of this simple, I wouldn't call them simple, but I was approaching them in a very literary sense. I was reading all sorts of literature. That is when I stumbled across the Yoga Sutras, which I started as a literary pursuit. And I was kind of getting the meanings of what is being conveyed in the Yoga Sutras, but I knew that what is being conveyed, even if I understand it at a textual level, that is not true for me. The kind of experiences, the kind of states which are being talked about, I have never really experienced them. I didn't even know they exist. Is it true? Is it what? I mean, what incentive does Patanjali Maharshi have to lie about these things? So they must be true, but I don't know them. So I started looking for explanations of Sanskrit verses in English or in any other language that I can find, which I never really did before. The best I would refer to is a dictionary. Now I'm looking for interpretations and explanations, which slowly got me into the realm of spirituality. And Sadhguru's videos I found all other gurus' videos, and among them I found Sadhguru to be very articulate, his way of expression to be very, very relatable in terms of contemporary vocabulary, using contemporary vocabulary, and presenting stuff in terms which I could relate with. So I started looking at who Sadhguru is, what Isha Foundation is, and all that stuff, and found that they are offering a program very close to my office. And that is when I signed. They said free talk. Initial talk is free. I said, free. So let's go. And I went and sat there. The teacher who was conducting the program spoke in the same language, very similar terminology and everything. Yeah, these guys seem to be consistent. Okay, they seem to know what they're talking about. Let me enroll for the program and see. It's that inner engineering. It's a 7-day program, and at the end of the program is when you hit. It's designed in such a way that it opens up states of experience which probably you have not known existed before. And once I knew that this is a realistic possibility in life, that this is not just. It's not just either fiction, or it's not too up there that it is unattainable. It's something that is within your capability, and there are methods to get there. I said, this is it, I have hit a gold mine. Now this is where you need to focus your energies on, because I found stuff which was adding that value to my life, and which was building that, giving me that sense of exuberance and aliveness which I was looking for. So after Shambhavi, that's when the ashram phase of life started. I don't know, maybe this is out of scope, in scope, I don't know for
that. You can talk
for
about
that. Yeah, so there is an ashram in Coimbatore of Isha Foundation. It's extremely beautiful. Now they have grown like tremendously, but it was relatively quaint place a couple of years ago, like half a decade ago. I went there. And the entire organization is volunteer run. There are now multiple million, like tens of millions of volunteers probably. And the sense of belonging, the sense of owning up any work that is done, everything. I was literally transported into a new world. Never knew this kind, and that was the first ashram of any kind. I've then been to Chinmaya missions and all the other kinds of spiritual centers around, but that was my first experience to an actual spiritual place where people approached each other in a different sense. The kind of interactions that we have with each other here are entirely different from how interactions happen there. So I kept going back again and again and again, like extremely frequently. And after some time, it just did not make any sense to keep traveling that much. So I decided I'll quit my job. By that time, I had done more programs, which got me deeper and deeper into different. It starts. They empowered me in exploring what Yoga Sutras were in a much more practical way. So I started. I quit my job by then because I was fully convinced. I had a little bit of savings by then, which I thought would sustain for a long time. Later on, realized that was not the case. But I quit the job. Parents were like completely, like they're flipping out because we have paid such fees, and like we've gone into, we have you've gone through so much education, and you've like got to a state where which many people aspire towards, that you have a well-paying job and you have financial security on all that. You're leaving that for what, to go do some yoga program. You can do it while doing this also. But anyways, I wanted to be there like full time. I wanted to just soak whatever the place has to offer, and I got to know experientially many things. Like that was the first time I even got a taste of what devotion can be, what being devoted to something means. This might seem a little flamboyant and like blowing my own trumpet, but yeah. So I found that taste of devotion, and so there is this beautiful way Sadhguru puts it, that in this culture people take pride in being a willing slave. Right? So people name themselves Haridas or Devidas, Kalidas. So being that Dasa Bhava, if you do it willingly, that you are, you give yourself fully and without any resistance of any sort, that is the most beautiful way of being. There is such immense sweetness of life that comes about. So I tasted a little bit of it, and it's a different kind of a high altogether, that you want to be in that zone forever. And Devi was that there is a Linga Bhairavi temple in ashram, and still is the most magical place on earth for me. So I was there for a good 3 and a little years, and I finished. They have different levels of programs that they offer. The final one being a very extremely intense program, which they offer for free. But the criteria is you have to have done many other programs, like 3 other programs before. So they know you are committed, but they offer that intense program for free for 7 days. It's called Samyama for people who want to know about it. I did that, and as with every other program, all of them are back-breaking sadhana. Like your spine is either tingling or it's cursing you at the end of the day. But they are extremely efficient. There's one thing that Sadhguru's program, they're efficient. If you do the practice right, it doesn't fail. At least it hasn't failed for me. I can say for sure that they have been 100%, like if they're extremely efficient. So once I finished Samyama, then I thought, and by then that is kind of the program, and a little bit of clarity dawned that this is what I need to be doing, this is what I need to be spending my time and energy doing, and I did not want to stay in the ashram forever. I want to go back, or I want to, I also wanted to build a social life. I kind of had this dilemma before that. What is this? Is the ascetic path for me? Should I take a brahmacharya or sannyas, or should I go? Should I not do that? Then by the end of Samyam, I got that clarity that no, guys, this brahmacharya is not for me. So I came back home, and then I slowly started teaching Sanskrit and making videos and all that. That pursuit of the Sanskrit channel and all that stuff happened after I came back.
What was the
Talked for
reason?
so long, no?
What was the reason behind starting a YouTube channel? I mean, you could have gone on to study on yourself, but what was the reason behind starting a YouTube channel?
Multiple reasons, Anna. So as I said, after I came back, I wanted to teach. That is what I wanted to do, and I knew that this is what added value to my life. The pursuit of Yoga Sutras and the knowledge of Sanskrit is what led me towards spirituality, and there's so much of such value that people can get. And I wanted other people to also experience it and to present that there is this possibility. So I started conducting work. Before that itself, I used to conduct odd jobs like here and there, workshops of 3 days, 5 days, to get a little amount of money. So you don't make much doing workshops, one-off workshops, but it's decent. You can get through the month. But conducting regular classes is a whole different game, because once you are done with the the simple stuff, once that complexity starts, people are like, what is in it for me? Is that sentence correct? What is in it for me? And all that stuff, and people generally taper off. I was left with 4 or 5 like really intense students who want to actually grasp all that and listen. So monetarily it doesn't make any sense. I never was comfortable with charging a fee, a set fee. I don't know, somehow within myself I can't set, if you sit with me for 1 hour, this is the price you have to pay. I could never come to terms with that. Or even if I did, if I charged, it was not something that was very sustainable for me monetarily. So the only way I could do it was, in my opinion, at scale. And I was actually working for Google before that IT stint, that corporate job. I was working in Synopsys for some time, and then I moved to Google, looking for a work-life balance. But anyways, that's in the past. So I knew the world of AdSense and how content is consumed. And because of this engineering background, I had the technical know-how of how to edit videos, or just my way around using applications and creating thumbnails, Premiere Pro, all that stuff. And so I kind of had a rough idea that if I want to maximize the returns, even for me monetarily and as impact, I have to do it at scale, and that is possible online. So I slowly started watching how do people go about creating a video, all the dividing my work into stages. How do I? So talking to a camera is still a big challenge for me. I can talk to people forever like this, but if I look at a camera and I have to speak, I just go blank. Even if I have prepared that this is what I'm going to talk about, I look at a camera, there's no feedback, I'm like, just the mind goes flat lines. So I basically learned everything from YouTube, figured out ways of overcoming those little hurdles. I wanted to do it at scale, and compared to my offline workshops in different parts of the city. And once I started doing it online, made these small videos, the feedback was good. There were people were kind of appreciative of it in the comments. That kind of motivated me that it's reaching more people. So the impact of it was also good in terms of it reaching many people. And for me also, it made a little much better monetary sense than taking offline classes. Now, fortunately, I'm at a place where I can actually build a team and get more people on board. Probably this is a good thing to reveal on your channel, that I also soon will be putting up that the Sanskrit channel is hiring. So that is going to be a big step.
Nice. We have a news here.
Breaking news on High Road. So the Sanskrit channel is hiring. But I'll put up and we have recently launched this course on Google Classroom. So the first batch came up on 15th of February, which is Vasanta Panchami, and around 1,000 participants. In Excel sheet, if I did the unique values by country, 77 came.
77 countries.
Yeah, 77 different countries,
Amazing.
but India, Bharat, all that's counted as two people who write Bharat and all. But USA and United States of America comes as two, so that is there. But roughly there, like around 50 plus maybe.
So, people from other countries, Indians or?
All sorts, right? People like non-resident Indians or basically residents of 50 plus countries. Are they also Indians? Are they from other? There are definitely participants of other languages and other countries. But yeah, there's worldwide reach now. The impact is much better than conducting offline classes, and you can also grow work and bring more people, make it economically much more viable for many more people. Because Sanskrit as a language, many people there is the aesthetics of language and the rewarding nature of exploring exploring art at one level, but people do not really pursue it large scale as a full-time pursuit because it's not economically viable. It doesn't make any monetary sense to invest full-time into it unless you are fortunate or you find that right set of skills that make you reach as many people as possible, which has been the case with me. So I want to make it a little more lucrative for people who want to get into the stream but do not have to do something else because this doesn't pay well. So probably build a organization of sorts. That is why I did not, I want to keep it as an organization which runs, which is economically feasible. It's not a charity thing. It's not done to spend money. We make money in the process, make livelihoods, and help people take it up as a full-time pursuit without having to do it as a hobby. I mean, I keep telling people, so this why Sanskrit keeps coming up multiple times. Why should somebody read Sanskrit? There are hundreds of reasons, but if you're looking for reasons to do it, you need not do it. Nobody's asking anybody to do it. But if you really love doing it and you start doing it, you find those reasons to love it for yourself. Yes, so that is it.
You talked about it is not easy to face camera. I mean, many people go through this, especially in the initial stages.
That helped me. I googled this blanking out or zoning out in front of camera, and I found it's a real phenomenon. It's not just me who is that dumb to not be able to speak, but people go through it, and that gave me kind of a boost that okay, there are other people. This is the real thing. So it can be gotten through.
So what were your initial challenges putting yourself out in the public, starting a YouTube channel? Because
much of any challenges. This was one, the camera block, looking at it.
Like you were also saying initially, I mean, people tend to think, oh, only 100 views I'm getting. I mean, initially there might not be many views who are looking at your channel or anything. So how did you motivate yourself to keep doing this, what you love?
I kind of had a vision in my head that this is what, and I was in the zone that this is what I want to do it. Even if many people do not watch it, I find joy out of learning it for myself. That is again one of the aspects of one of the benefits compared to teaching it offline is in offline classes, if you start a new batch, you have to start from scratch and teach them the whole thing again. You do that online, you create that content, you present some topic well enough, you don't have to do it again. The next batch of students, those topics which can be presented for beginners, they are already there. You can move on to newer areas of exploration for yourself. So that kind of kept me going, that even if even if the level of success or reach that did not happen to the channel, I'd still be keeping, making those videos. I'd still be learning newer verses. I'd be moving on with my own Sanskrit learning. So it's only fortunate. It's only a fortunate side product that people have also found benefit to it. If only one person watched it, nobody watched it, I would probably also do something else to make money, to make a livelihood. But still, I would be doing the same things, maybe in a different format. This format allows exposure and impact, and in the return for value that I provide, I get I wouldn't want to call it a compensation, but I get paid for it. Yeah.
So you said that like you wanted to come out of Fisha, you know, to have a social life and also to earn money. So, but your channel is not monetized. I mean, you don't monetize it. So, what made you, you know, to decide that no, I'm not going to monetize it? And how hard or easy was it for you to decide that no running of ads on the channel?
No,
And were you sure that people, if people see value in it, they will somehow contribute?
Yeah, that was there. The second part of what you said is definitely there. That I kind of was convinced that this is how the world works in terms of exchange of value.
Did you at any
You present-
point was your channel monetized or?
No. I knew that if you create something of value, if people find value in it, you will eventually get that value back, and that is the way we see value is money. But the thing is, the default setting is not monetized. The default setting is demonetized only in YouTube. You start up without ads, and I kind of was until like 10,000 or something. You can't show ads anyways.
Yeah.
And I also found these gaming channels, and I used to like PC games. I am a fan of. Nowadays I don't play as much because I see it as a big time sink. But otherwise I used to play all video games on PC, and I saw that these gamers, live streaming gamers, they put up their UPI IDs up on screen, and people who watch them play, not even playing a video game, just watching them play walkthroughs of videos, they pay them real-time money. Like you see on screen the plus 40 rupees, plus 50 rupees, plus 100 rupees. Like, this is wonderful. Like if people can watch other people play video games, they can definitely pay other people, giving them some sort of useful info or something that adds a little bit of value in their life. So I thought, why not do this for myself? Why not crowdfund? And being in Google already myself, I know that if you are through AdSense, you are at the kind of the mercy of YouTube. If there are copyright strikes which come chock-a-block, like if you especially have a chant, you do something as simple as Ramcharitmanas or Hanuman Chalisa or something that is already there in public domain, Ayigiri Nandini for example, some other music label will come, automatically there will be a copyright strike on your channel. So I do not want to take that risk, and that is affected only when you're monetizing through ads. So they don't want that, they take that piracy concerns very seriously. If you don't have ads on it, it's not as serious. And also there are very simple issues like that. And one big thing is, of course, because there are chants on the channel, I am very inconvenienced or irked by ads playing in between chants or songs. So there's a beautiful groove you are in, well, these sounds of Isha chants are going on, or some kind of a beautiful song is going on. Suddenly there like the most bizarre jarring kind of sound you can hear, and there is an ad playing. It's very disturbing. So why have the audience go through that experience? And there are platforms like patreon.com which enable people who love your content to directly pay you to keep you going. So I thought that is the better way of going about it, rather than showing ads or brand deals. I don't think I'm very against, but who will come for a brand deal with the Sanskrit channel? Maybe educational platforms do, but I never really had to do it. People have been generous enough, people have been kind enough to support me, and they keep supporting. So as I said, we are at a stage where we can actually build the team, and I have been thinking, this plan has been there for a long time, that I have to set up a dedicated space for the Sanskrit channel where we can shoot videos rather than just do it, set up and then take it off, set up, take it off. Just have that setup there, just go on exploring content for longer and longer durations. And let's see, slow baby steps.
Why I'm asking this question is, many people who wanted to start channel, they get caught up in the number game, and how will I be able to sustain myself if not for advertisements or anything else. So this is more questions from the point of view of an YouTube.
As a budding YouTube channel yourself. Yeah. But if you don't ignore the numbers which seem small initially. You don't think, okay, I only got 200 views. 200 is a big number. you would know that. I mean, if you just directly start off with YouTube, maybe you don't think 200 is a big number. If you are doing offline classes, right, you check with these people who conduct talks or in real places. Having 50 people turn up to your event is a big thing for people who are getting started. Like in that kind of a setup, a video is getting you 500 views, you must celebrate, right? 500. We really don't have a sense of, our brains are very interestingly wired. We think million is a big number. Million is of course a humongous number, but 1,000 is a big number too. It's enormous. 1,000 people watched your video, means a lot. So you have to keep that perspective and see that you have actually delivered that value that many times. And if those people found value in that piece of content, you see how you can create it again and again. And most importantly, see if it's adding value to your life, and if you can consistently keep that up, and if you can do that, then it definitely is rewarding. It pays out in the long run.
How do you feel, after seeing the impact of your work to reaching so many people? Does it feel fulfilling? How do you feel now? At what stage of your thoughts are right now in terms of growth of channel? And
my medium of communication is English. Almost, I mean, how many people in the world speak English? I want to reach all of them. So in that sense, I mean, people have been I've been fortunate. People have been subscribing, and we just met somebody who subscribed, and then people find value. The most touching, the most satisfied or fulfilled I feel is when I'll give you one instance, because I crowdfund. One girl, young kid. There was a transfer of 30 rupees or 33 rupees of some kind, and she said, "Bhaiya, I have only this much. I get pocket money from my parents. I'm in so and so class, but I gave you this money." I was like, "Oh my God, you keep that money for yourself? You do something or do?" But she was like, "No, I really loved watching some video, and I was looking for this explanation for a long time. Yours helped a lot." And that kind of it can't be matched with any kind of numbers, or maybe numbers also help, but it's very touching. It's very inspiring to see that it has moved somebody to such state that they want to help you out. Anyways, so that is when I feel that okay, I am successful in doing what I want to do. But in terms of content to be explored, there's simply not enough time and not enough resource to present and create the kind of content that I have in mind. There's not enough words to present what the kind of buzzing around that is going in the head anyways, but even it's difficult to even scratch the surface on if we just keep creating content, even at the pace that I'm doing right now, which is insane, but you have to just churn out content, and also be smart about it, that when do you put out what content. So if Mahashivratri is coming up, put Shiva related content. Be smart about how you create and how you time your content. If Navratris are coming up, put Devi related content, like stuff like that.
How do you balance out things, strategizing and doing just what comes from the heart?
Everything comes from the heart only.
I mean, in the sense
that there are 100 different topics. You want to also do Upanishads, or you're doing Sundarakanda already, but Mahashivratri is coming up, you kind of give it a pause. Or sometimes it's not possible, you don't be too harsh on yourself.
How much of is it conscious? I mean, conscious.
Everything of it is conscious. Sometimes it so happens that out of sheer luck, that this event is coming up. So for example, Ratha Saptami, I had no clue that Ratha Saptami is coming up. But that previous night I knew that, okay, tomorrow is Ratha Saptami, oh my God. Then I already had Aditya Hridayam on the channel, so I just reshared it. Sometimes I know well in advance that, okay, this is the event coming up, let's create content around it. Because people might be looking for that content during that time. So that most of it is conscious, sometimes out of luck, or out of it so happens that there are the kind of presentation ideas is definitely not completely conscious. It's, you know, at the end of practices, sometimes sadhana, yoga sadhana, this idea comes, oh, this can be done in this kind of way. The Shiva Tandava Stotram, that presentation in terms of layers, a lot of people have benefited, I mean, have watched the video and found it useful and shared with me that I've always wanted to learn Shiva Tandava Stotram. In your video, I could finally learn it, because I got it down to that level. At one level, I have to be explained things at a very, very dumbed down level. Things have to be explained to me like I'm 5. So I look at it like that. If I have to explain it to somebody, language is still a barrier. The kind of words that I choose, some of the words that come naturally sometimes are a little roundabout or complicated. I still try to simplify it as simple as I can. But how to present it, how to simplify stuff, how to present the core of it in the most simplest way possible, in the way people can relate it easiest. Those kind of things come at the end of practices, sometimes Shunya, sometimes Shambhavi. It's not the most ideal thing to do, that you're thinking of something else and doing something else, but they kind of dawn upon you that, okay, this another angle of presenting this is something that that's unique, which has been one of the USPs of the channel.
You talked about this. People give feedback, beautiful. People say beautiful things when they're impacted. I'm sure there are also people who just give hatred.
Yeah.
So what is the worst thing? I mean, thing you have heard, like silly things.
Many people say many things, but I kind of it's easy to focus. This I had to take some time to get to this understanding, to realize this, that we naturally tend to pay more attention to negative things being said. 10 people might have said, "Wow, this is amazing. You have done so much. You provided so much value." One person says nonsense, or this is bullshit or something else. That you kind of tend to, your mind tends to ponder around that and see if something has gone wrong. But it's like that, right? If there's a big white paper, you put a black mark, or you put a stain somewhere. If there's a big white shirt, there is a stain somewhere at some end. Your attention is going. There is some evolutionary reason why this happens. But you have to have that perspective on again, that there are all sorts of people on the internet. I see dislikes on not my videos, on some videos which make no sense to me. Like, why would somebody come willingly to a video, not that it's been thrust in their face? Maybe YouTube recommended it. They need not have clicked on that video. They go to that video and click on the dislike button, and there was plenty of option to just not ignore it altogether. You have to just, all sorts of people.
You said that you are not.
YouTube, fortunately, I mean, I'm not sure Twitter has, but YouTube fortunately has this option of banning people. Okay. So if somebody is consistently putting negative comments, like not just for one video, but they have something against you or the way you are.
This happened with you?
Yeah. Tens of people.
Like there are some people who are dumb in a way. I mean, they just want to spread hatred, but there are also people, who, like you said, you are not the expert in Sanskrit language, but some people they are, but they get offended very easily, who might know Sanskrit in a better way, intellectually maybe, but they get offended easily, and then they just
I have not fortunately found anybody like that yet on the channel. If they happen, same formula. Ban option is there. You can ban, it's not, or simply ignore. And one thing that you have to remember, again, if there is some budding YouTuber or somebody, one thing that you have to remember is even bad publicity is good publicity. There's some kind of a phrase like this: every publicity is good publicity, some sort of stuff. If there are negative comments, if you have positive people, they kind of go there, engage and support you and back you up. They give you, they kind of fight the guy who is abusing you or who is going against you.
It helps
that helps the algorithm. I'm not even kidding. It does. Yeah. So more power to you. So invite people who are abusing you or that stuff probably. People like इसमें भी है ना Rockstar movie. Negative sells. Even titles, right? Video titles, you see, you put something very scandalous, something something negative,
Clickbait.
something even among clickbait, you put some positive clickbait, very little people will watch. More people compared to no clickbait. You put a negative clickbait that something has gone wrong, okay, the sky is going to break and fall apart, people will people will watch that more. I'm not kidding. Yeah, you can experiment with it. You can do A/B testing, like put same video, put negative title, negative thumbnail, positive title. You'll see naturally this is what. It's unfortunate, but mindset of people. You can either make your terms with it and see how you can ride it, or kind of be bogged down by it. It's up to you.
How has teaching helped you in learning? Like, especially in YouTube, you have to put out content every week, and you're constantly exploring.
Yeah.
You have to find something new to, give your audience.
Yeah.
So how has that helped you in?
So as I said, right, so the one of the main benefits, one of the main advantages of creating content online compared to workshops is that you don't have to repeat whatever you have done. In some sense, you should not repeat. You cannot repeat what you've already covered. So it kind of pushes me to newer and newer topics. And as I again mentioned before, I kind of look at how I can present something as I want it to be presented to myself if I were learning it. I want stuff to be like nicely pasted and put it like spoon fed to me, like I'm 5 years old. I kind of look at everything like that. And I also think unless I completely understand it intuitively, if I teach it to somebody else, they know that, okay, this guy is talking something he's not in terms with. I think that comes very clearly, that comes across very clearly, that you're talking something which is not true in your own understanding, which you just read somewhere, or you just, you're not convinced with totally, you don't know for yourself. You're presenting it like you memorized it, or you have, just read it from somewhere. It comes across to the audience that, ye dimag mein kuch aur chal raha hai iska, yeah. It's not convincing enough. It doesn't reach. So I have to think about what is being presented. If something is mentioned somewhere, I have to pay a lot of attention to it, to internalize it, to understand it, until a point where it becomes, it resonates with me at a very convincing level. So if I'm convinced myself, okay, that this is what this topic says, then I can then play with it on how to deliver it in different ways. What is the simplest way of presenting it? If I myself am not completely have not come to terms with what is being conveyed in any particular text or any topic, then there is no possibility. The only way I can present it is the same way as it has been done. This happens with, not to blame, but this happens with some of these lecturers, at least I had in college, who come with a PPT. They put the slides and just read the sentences as it is on what is there on the PPT. If you have to just read it, why even bother coming, bringing us all to class and just read the exact line to line? So if somebody knows it intuitively, there is this physics. One of the biggest influences in the way I teach has been this physics professor of MIT called Walter Lewin. His demonstrations of physics concepts are so simple and yet so evident, and so even the most abstract concepts of physics, he presents them very very intuitively, that anybody who watches that demonstration or watches that presentation knows it very intuitively. And Richard Feynman, and these people, I used to love physics also in school and college. So these people, I especially if somebody teaches something really well, I find it extremely inspiring. Especially in stand-up comics, Biswa Kalyan Rath, even if his comedy itself can be a little crude sometimes, he is an amazing explainer. He's an amazing, he has an amazing knack for explaining things in a very simple and relatable way. So when other teachers do it, I notice it, and it gives me a lot of joy and inspiration that, yeah, this is how, because I heard this quote somewhere that there's no bad student, there's only a bad teacher. So if somebody is not getting something, it's not that the topic is too hard or something to get. There's nobody who is skilled enough to explain it in terms which are easy to get. like how I just mentioned this in as roundabout sentence as I could. I'll probably, when I have sentences like this, I'll sit right down and see how I can make the delivery simpler, how people can get it easier. So yeah, teaching and having a focus on how it can be taught, a specific subject can be taught, will immensely help you internalize what has been, what you are learning yourself.
So, like we discussed, how Sanskrit can in itself can be a doorway to reach the ultimate. It is the language of the gods, as we explored. But and you have also done yoga, in the sense, practicing actual yoga. So, how has Sanskrit added a layer to your spirituality seeking?
Yeah, they are mutually complementary. So so if I read, I started with the study of Yoga Sutras where I was not able to understand it, experience it as truth for myself. Once I started the practice, some aspects of it, the first few aspects of it, kind of started to make sense. That there's kind of clarity dawned that yes, this is what the first sutra means. This is what the second sutra means. This is the state which is being talked about. These are the 5 states of being that a human being can go through in daily life. So these practices give an experience of what is being talked about in the text, and the text kind of opens up possibilities of other realms that can be experienced through these practices. And the text and those words have a beauty among themselves which can be relished. As you read it, you kind of taste them. There's those words. So it's I would say Sanskrit is as much a thing of bhoga as it is of yoga. So there's an element of relishing it, of being. It's not only for spiritual people. There's a lot of romance and there's a lot of juiciness to the language. So Sanskrit is not only for people who are interested in the pursuit of yoga. It has enough richness and enough vocabulary to cater to a wider audience who are looking for entertainment or who are looking for general intellectual pursuits.
So it adds a layer to your yoga spirituality. And how what is its application in art, music, and Ayurveda, other forms?
Okay, so the very foundation, as I said, has its applications everywhere. Life in general, of realizing what the nature of things around you are, what the sounds that correspond to them are. They do not, I mean, be it music, astronomy, or medicine, or mathematics, the keener your sense of perception is of how creation functions around you. It doesn't matter which field of pursuit you are in, right? Business or politics or warfare or how you conduct your desire, how you conduct your familial affairs, how you conduct things with, how you measure things, how you create buildings. So that keenness of perception, that which is the very foundation of how Sanskrit sounds are arranged, adds that layer of profoundness and adds that those insights into every field of study. So so there is, of course, you take any text, like as you mentioned Ayurveda, you take up Charaka Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, or Ashtanga Hridayam. These texts, they mention these observations and realizations based on that in my understanding, it is how it is, that underlying sense of unity between sound as creation, and how those sounds are kept as close to how they are with creation in language also, adds that layer of value to experience, or to get into deeper and deeper pursuits of any field of life.
So how are you looking at the channel in future? What is your aim? Ideally, what do you want to come out of it?
Oh, there's too many things. So ideally, to chodo, like in the next few months, there's not enough time. There's only so much that can be done. That is my regret. I want to. So this is the thought that I had, that I want to enable other people to be able to grasp and realize and understand these texts and create explainer topics of their own, so that we can cover as many fields as possible, as quickly as possible, and deliver it to as many people as possible. So I want to skill up other people. So kind of train the trainer kind of program where we have this space is actually wonderful. I don't know, maybe you take a B-roll of the place later on. So maybe a place like this where there are different kinds of places, different kinds of nooks for different fields of study. So because I'm not an expert on anything for that matter, but I'm definitely not an expert on everything. So I know a little bit of Sanskrit and how to put videos together and how to explain this and stuff. It's stuff that is most relatable. But people who are experts in their own fields of astronomy, of Jyotisha Shastra, of Ayurveda, or of Vastu, they have very deep subject related knowledge. But I think personally that the areas that they lack in is the technical know-how of how to present it, what kind of software tools to use, what duration of videos to make, how to grab people's attention, how to create thumbnails, how to create titles, all that stuff. So that is one of the things that I want to do as an overarching project. There are multiple sub-projects on how to create, on what topics to create videos on. There's hundreds of topics there. But as an overarching idea, my ideal situation would be to create a content creation space and a collaborative learning space where people who are subject experts and who explain stuff like other people are 5-year-old kids, learn their own fields of, get deeper into their own fields of study, create content which is of value, which provides this know-how. Because as I said at the very beginning, people know about Sanskrit. Everybody has read these WhatsApp messages that, oh, Sanskrit has these many things, guys. Now see 100 different points which tell us about how great Sanskrit is. We have forever been just talking about how great Sanskrit is, or about the language, than the actual content which is within the language. So that has to be presented. If that is presented, nobody has to go about beating the drum forever that, yeah, bahut badhiya, great, mahan. If you present the actual content, then people will know naturally that, okay, this is what is great about it. You don't have to keep repeating. I want to build content in regional languages, cater to Hindi audiences, Telugu, Tamil, and Kannada, Bengali, Gujarati, Marathi. Just because if you learn Sanskrit in those languages, it's much more intuitive than how I'm presenting right now. You would see the level of clarity that can be presented, that can dawn upon people's minds is humongous when you present topics in native languages which are much closer to Sanskrit than English is. We'll get there, baby steps.
Can you pick one of your favorite sloks and can you recite it for us? I heard your Saundarya Lahari recent videos.
It is one of my most favorites. But I would probably not pick a Saundarya Lahari shloka. You want some Saundarya Lahari shloka?
No, anything, one of your favorites.
Again, the many favorites. Bhavanitvam Dase in Saundarya Lahari is wonderful. It covers multiple topics of what we have.
Before you start, give us a context of what it is.
Oh, cool. Is it too... I don't know if this can be... Are you going to... This is a wonderful background to put text on. Okay. Can you do that? I can help you with it, how to put Sanskrit text. We can. So this is a shloka from Saundarya Lahari. I don't remember the number. Out of the 100 shlokas, this is one. Saundarya Lahari is composed by Adi Shankaracharya in a poetic meter called as Shikharini. Shikharini is... Shikhar to jante hain sab. Shikhar is a mountain. Shikharini is the daughter of a mountain. Parvata mountain, Parvati mountain. Saundarya Lahari is talking about Parvati, goddess Shakti. And the poetic meter, the rhythm in which it is set, is also called as Shikharini, Chandas. So it's one meta layer of information, but the shloka itself is very beautiful in itself. This talks about, here in this shloka, Adi Shankaracharya says, and I'm just thinking how to present it in the most uh, intuitive sense. Uh, he's uh, he praises the goddess and tells her that she's too lenient, too generous. She's to somebody who prays to her. She grants who prays to her asking for something very meager, very lowly. She grants her the ultimate, and she showers abundance upon that person. So he is almost complaining that you're being too generous. So that and he gives a kind of a grammatical explanation for why that is happening. So the shloka goes. Do you want me to recite it?
Yeah.
Okay. This poetic meter goes na 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 na. So it's the same same pattern in every line. I'll just chant it normally once, like spoken once. So it goes Bhavani Tvam Dase Mayi Vitara Drishtim Sakarunam iti stotum vanchan kathayati Bhavani Tvam iti yaha tadaiva Tvam tasmai dishasi nija sayujya padavim mukunda brahma indra sphuta makuta nirajita padam. So these are the words. I'll chant it once and see if and then later we'll get to the meanings of it. Conscious of chanting. Bhavani Tvam Dase Mayi Vitara Drishtim Sakaruna Ite Stotum Vanchan Kathayati Bhavani Tvamiti Yaha Tadaiva Tvam Tasmai Dishasi Nija Sayojya Padavi Mukunda Brahmendra Sputamakuta Nirajita Padam. So this is how it is chanted. So the meaning of the words is, in the first line he says, Bhavani, O goddess. Her name is Bhavani and he is addressing her. Bhavani, Tvam, you, Dase Mayi, in your slave, who is me, Vitara, shower, Drishtim Sakarunam, shower your merciful glances. Iti stotum vanchan kathayati bhavani tvam itiyaha. Somebody who wishes to praise you, thus, who wishes to worship you and seek your blessing, saying these words. Which words? O goddess, shower your merciful glances upon me. Very simple, very meager ask. Kindly look at me with compassion. Tadaiva tvam tasmai dishasi nija sayujya padavim. As soon as somebody asks you that simple thing, you give that person unity with your own self. You make that person your own self, like the stature of being you. Because, he doesn't say because yet, it is implied. Because the words Bhavani is one of the other forms of Bhavami. Bhavami can also become Bhavani when it is used in the sense of I should be. Aham engineer Bhavani, means I must be an engineer. So Bhavani is I must be and Tvam is you. In that very first two words, Bhavani Tvam, which also has a different meaning. O goddess, you give me, shower me compassionate glances, can also be the very first two words can be interpreted as I must be you. So Bhavani Tvam. You need not say Bhavani Tvam Dase Mayi Vitara Drishtim Sakarunam. You can just say Bhavani Tvam. As soon as he says the first two words, you give him the stature of being your own self, because he's asking for that in one sense, in the first two words itself. Then what kind of stature is that, being one with the goddess, is Mukunda Brahma Indra. Vishnu, Brahma and Indra. Sphuta Makuta, shining crowns. Nirajita Padam, worshipped feet. The meaning of the sentence is the stature, the kind of stature you offer that person, that stature which is such that it is that being in that stature, one's feet are being Nirajana is being offered by the glitter on the crowns of Mukunda, Brahma and Indra, of Vishnu, Brahma and Indra. Kind of there, I don't know. So the gist, the summary of this can be, O goddess, who is extremely generous, as soon as somebody seeks you for something as meager as showering your compassionate glances upon that person, you give that person the stature of being one with your own self. That stature which is worshipped, that stature in which one's feet are worshipped by the glitter, by the shine on the crowns of Vishnu, Brahma and Indra, of the likes of Vishnu. So this is an interesting combination of wordplay and beautiful emotion and all that stuff. There are many shlokas which are very interesting, and which many shlokas which inspire different kinds of emotions, different kinds of feelings. There are some which give you an intellectual satisfaction, some which tug at your heartstrings. So this one is slightly emotional kind of thing.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
Really,
My
from the
pleasure.
bottom of my heart.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Is there anything you would like to say?
Oh, yes, of course. Please subscribe to High Road. Ramana is doing a wonderful job. He's putting in a lot of effort for sure. We would love to have your help in some of the videos in the future also. So there are multiple plans we have for the Sanskrit channel. I don't want to plug myself again, but please subscribe to High Road. He has wonderful conversations like this. He has many. This is what he wants to do. He wants to bring people more attention, bring content which is of very deep and profound impact in people's lives, who are doing, people and entrepreneurs who are doing, entrepreneurs who are doing a marvelous job. So please subscribe to the High Road. Make sure you click on that notifications button and click and enable all notifications. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And also, if you just happen to not know the Sanskrit channel,
please subscribe to my channel.
I'll tag the Sanskrit channel, and please subscribe. Thank you.